Kantika. It's a song that becomes an anchor for an uprooted mother who flees from Istanbul to Barcelona to New York City to protect her children in turbulent times. In the hands of Elizabeth Graver, Kantika is a brilliant and unforgettable novel. In this episode of Why Authors Write, I talk with Elizabeth about why and how she transformed her own family history into a universal family story about survival and the struggle to balance integration and identity. Welcome and thank you to Elizabeth Graver, who is the author of Kantika, an award-winning book based on her own family history. I'm super excited, Elizabeth, to welcome you, and I want to hear more about why you wrote the book for this podcast episode of Why Authors Write.
Thank you for welcoming me. It's great to be here.
I've read in what you've already written and in other interviews, Elizabeth, that for a long time you resisted turning this well-known family history inside your own family into a book and fictionalizing a very private part of your family's life history into something that inevitably becomes a different kind of story in the process of making it a novel. So I see you nodding, and therefore I want you to start by saying, do you remember and can you share a trigger moment when you actually said, I have to write this story as a novel. I'm ready.
I'm not actually sure, Mary, that there was one moment. It's a complicated trajectory. So let me take you back to what really feels like the first seed, which was decades ago. So when I was 21, I'm now 61, I taped my grandmother Rebecca telling stories. I was in college. I had an internship at a newspaper. It was the 80s, so I had this little cassette recorder that I thought was super cool that had these teeny micro cassettes, and I was going around interviewing people for the Berkshire Eagle and the Hartford Courant, but not doing family history. And at the same time, I had this aging grandmother who I was very close to and felt a lot of kinship with. She was very creative. We would draw and sew together. She would sing with me. She would cook with me. I always felt she could really sort of see into my soul, sometimes in almost scary ways. She was just super perceptive. I couldn't hide. But I also found her quite mysterious. So she was from another country or other countries. She had a foreign accent. She was Jewish, but very differently Jewish from my father's side of the family, who were Ashkenazi Jews, which is much more common in this country. Yiddish speaking and Eastern European, whole different set of foods and customs. So I was very interested in her, and I think I also felt, even at that moment, that she was aging and that I both wanted to hold on to her story and learn more about it and wanted her to have the experience of knowing that it was important, or a feeling that I understood. I think she actually knew it was important, but a feeling that somebody was listening. So I sat down with her and I recorded her maybe just for a couple hours. And I have those recordings. They're part of a video that I shared with you, bits of them. And she was a really good storyteller, but there were lots of holes because she was sort of skittering around and I wasn't systematically asking her to start at the beginning. And I actually didn't know enough about the wider history even to ask always the proper questions, I think. So those recordings sat with me for a very long time. And I wrote many other books, and most of them have nothing to do with her and overtly very little to do with my family history. The one that came out before Kantika is called The End of the Point, and it is very loosely, it's truly a novel, but inspired by my husband's family history. And so I was sort of suddenly picturing where was my family during the same period, and I had thought about it. I had these recordings. I think it felt hard. It felt scary for some of the reasons you kind of gestured toward. it's scary to write about your own family in terms of people's responses. But I think I was spurred to do it for a couple reasons. One was what was happening in the wider world and the wider country, and even my teaching. So I got really interested in the big and the small, and big history and how it intersects with private lives. And then the other thing I think that spurred me at that particular moment was the sense of the generation above me getting older. So my mother's now 89. She was in her late 80s when I started the book. My uncles, David and Albert, who were central characters, were living when I started the book, but sadly died before it came out. But they were there for the journey. They were there to help me. And I, again, wanted both access to their stories while they were still around, but I also, maybe even more importantly, wanted to do this sort of for them, as something that they could see and have and learn from and contribute to, at the same time that I didn't want it to be a sort of Hallmark portrait of a family. I wanted to be able to go into the dark corners. My family was remarkably good about that, but not all families would have handled it so well.
And that's a good turning point back to the story, the novel, Kantika, in that it's challenging to transform the details, the facts on the ground that you learn in your research or hear from your own family members. But for the sake of the arc of the novel, you want to fictionalize some things
Right.
and you want to deepen other things. So let's talk about that, Elizabeth. Can you give some examples of where you made a deliberate creative author decision to tell a different story or dig deeper into the facts to show a different side potentially of a story? And tell us about that. Was it hard? Was it liberating? How did it feel? And
No,
give
it was
some examples.
both. It's a great question. It was interesting to me that the parts that were in some ways easier to write were the ones set farther back. So one character who really took me by surprise was Alberto, my great grandfather. And I went deep inside his experience, but I knew very little. I knew maybe 5 things about him. I knew that he had been married twice and that he had lived in England for a decade to flee his first wife who couldn't have children. I knew that he wasn't a great businessman and loved to garden, as my mother and my grandmother and I do. So that was an interesting thread, especially in the context of immigration. You have to leave land, but you can bring your little seeds. And so he really stepped forward in some way that surprised me. I just found myself very interested in this old man who was kind of a romantic and kind of dignified and very much at home in Turkey. That was where he was from, and he didn't want to leave. That was a character where I had a lot of liberty, and I found his inner life and kind of making up scenes of him walking through the streets of Istanbul fascinating. I did go to Istanbul and walk those streets, but as I got closer to the present, it actually got harder because I felt that I had more people looking over my shoulder, and both a kind of obligation to want to include people's stories and a fear in some ways of going to places that were tricky. In some ways, fiction made that easier because it's a kind of screen. It's like, it's not true, I made it up. And anybody can say, oh, well, that's not how it happened. She made it up. So that was part of the reason I chose the genre of fiction. I also wanted very much to be able to get inside people's consciousnesses, which is much harder to do in nonfiction. And I actually wasn't interested in being in it myself. I'm kind of implicitly in it everywhere. And I'm sure in the way I'm imagining different scenes, it comes as much out of my own experience or inner life or soul, whatever, my vision, as the research. I wanted to be the kind of channel, not a figure.
I love what you said about you didn't have to get it all right. Every author, I think, who undertakes this kind of conversion or transformation of a historical episode, especially when it's your own family, it's such a delicate balance. And I'm going to point you back to what you said very quickly, Elizabeth, in passing, which is your family was very good about telling the dark stories and ask you for at least one example of a dark story that you decided it was okay to tell, and what, if anything, you changed about that story in the novel.
My grandmother was very notable for how open she was, and she spoke at things as she saw them. So, for example, there's a part of the story that I really took almost directly from the recordings I did with her when I was 21, where she talks about going to find her first husband, who's essentially sort of abandoned her and has health troubles, and he's gone back to Turkey, and she has to take this train and a boat and go on this terrible journey in the middle of winter with her tiny children. And she told me that in very explicit detail. I imagine characters based on my grandparents having a very robust love life. I go inside the bedroom, right? And you would think, that's a little uncomfortable, like if they're your grandparents. So I'm in a fictional mode when I'm doing it. But she was also someone who was very embodied and very open, and they would kiss and hug and touch in front of me. There was a sort of license in the way she lived and in the way she approached both joy and sorrow. So she had a stepdaughter, my Aunt Luna, who was quite disabled. She had cerebral palsy, also very, very bright and talented and strong-willed, as was Rebecca. And my grandmother also talked to me about her in very, very, very open ways. Writing about Luna was hard. I respected her. I loved her. She had writerly ambitions herself. She worked as a newspaper reporter in her retirement, and I wish she could have written her part of the story. She wasn't alive when I wrote it. So that felt, I hesitated. It took me a long time to want to write those sections, and I did a huge amount of research about disability and cerebral palsy treatment and what the language would have been of the time, because I wanted to be true to it while also recognizing that some of the words are not words I would use
And
now.
that
You know?
was actually one of the things that I found most difficult to read in the book. And
Yeah.
I specifically wondered, so I'll ask you, the Luna in the bathroom, Luna with the two
Yeah.
stepbrothers, Luna discovering her body and
Mm-hmm.
being proud of it, and then inviting those two boys, and then being discovered by Rebecca, and then Rebecca maybe deciding to send her away at that point.
Right.
Um, that sounded, it seemed profoundly real and also fictional. How did that feel to write it?
Well,
And
so my uncles both told me that story, which kind of astonished me. And they told it without too much shame. I don't want to totally give it away, but it's a complicated story where they're step siblings, and she's developing and sort of proud of her body and her new breasts, and they are kind of immature boys, and everyone's wielding power, and they're step siblings, and they're boys and she's a girl, so there's that imbalance. But so, yes, I mean, that scene was actually more complicated and a bit worse than the way I toned it down, because I didn't want the sort of shock value of it to take over. But they both talked to me about it, and I hesitated a little, but partly I would talk to my mother about these things, and she was like, if you want to write about my mother in America, if you want to capture my mother in both her strength and her troubles as she was in America, you need to write about her relationship with Luna, because it was very complicated. Luna was her stepchild. My grandfather had lost two babies. His wife had died in childbirth, giving birth to a child who died. He had a very disabled daughter. And my Rebecca comes in and is extraordinary in her ability to help and heal Luna and see her potential when her birth family adored her and took good care of her, but they didn't understand, they didn't know how to approach helping her. So that relationship felt really key and really hard. Once I got deep into it and started really asking my uncles, I spent several days with each of my uncles in their kind of retirement communities, and especially my uncle David, recording him, and he was really open. And everybody was willing to go there. And part of what was so interesting to me, that scene was hard to write, but it brings together so many things. It brings together all kinds of stuff about gender and bodies and disability that have actually long interested me. I've been writing about those things forever in different ways. It brings together questions of blended families, which were very interesting to me, thinking about this family as a family of the past. It's not the Brady Bunch, but they are coming with all of these steps and halves and allegiances. And although, so they had three kids. My grandfather came into the marriage with Luna, and my grandmother came in with Albert and David. And then they had three more kids together, including my mother. And I grew up close to everybody. But I think when I pictured and when I talked to my to my aunts and uncles and my mother about the way the dynamics played out with these new immigrants, it was not simple. And people's allegiances were most immediately to the children. My grandfather would do absolutely anything for Luna because she was the child of his first marriage and she was disabled, and he'd raised her alone, essentially, with his mother.
That was that was one of the most powerful scenes in the whole novel for me. I'm so fascinated that you actually ended up toning down that scene of all the scenes
Yeah.
because what your uncles were willing to share with you was so they were fine telling you all the
Yeah.
details. And now I understand when you said your family was willing to go there. And in some ways, maybe that made it easier to write about people who were still living while you were in the process of writing. I want to just ask one more question about Rebecca.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the wellspring of the story from so many ways. Was there anything that you, in retrospect or in the moment of writing, discovered about her that you didn't know?
She was a big storyteller. There were things that she told me that I got confirmed, most of which turned out to be true. So one of them was that she used to say, I grew up very rich. And she would say, better to be born rich than to be born poor and lose everything. And I remember as a kid thinking, that's kind of provocative. Is that really true? And I didn't quite believe it because she made up a lot. Like she would sometimes embroider Rebecca on store-bought things and pretend she'd made them. She wasn't a reliable narrator all the time. So there were ways in which I had to find out for myself by going to places and looking at records and figuring out, why did she speak French, for example? She went to Catholic French school. And I knew that from the recording. She told me she went to school with nuns, but I didn't really know until I looked into it and I learned a lot. I think I also didn't fully understand how much she had overcome and how long her journey was and how devastating it was for her, for example, to leave Spain and never see her parents again. I sensed in her always growing up, she was a joyful woman. She sang, she cooked, she never stopped creating, but she had a sorrow, a kind of distance when she was quiet, where she'd get this very pained look in her eyes sometimes. And she used to say, nobody knows what I've been through. Nobody knows. And I didn't really. I just knew there was something to investigate. So I think I both came to understand her as more privileged and as having suffered more. It just the vision just got more and more complex. And it was very interesting to me because I've led an extraordinarily privileged life. I went to the college I wanted to. There were just so many ways in which I was lucky. And so to have a much more visceral sense of the path that led to that was incredibly moving and even kind of inspiring as bumps come up in my own life where I run a little anxious. I can kind of overreact to things. And I'm like, what would I do if I were in her situation? So it enlarged my vision, I think.
It sounds like you became, in some ways, emotionally closer to Rebecca as an individual character in history after she had passed. And while you were writing the book, you understood, I love that, you understood her sorrow more
Yeah.
profoundly as
And,
well.
when someone's your grandmother, I always knew, I was always very interested, and I've always loved old people since I was little. Like, I interviewed the people at the nursing home in high school. Like, I've always been, in some ways, my attraction to this story has been with me That's why I interviewed her when I was 21. So it's not like I suddenly a light went off, but I do think, yes, on the one hand, I know her better. On the other hand, it's complicated because I've created a fictional character and I don't know what she would think. Like maybe I just know myself better. It's not her. And if she'd been alive, I would have written a different book. But that's not how it worked out. And so, do I know her better? I feel that I do because I've spent so much time and I've literally stood on the street where she was born. And, I've made all these sort of pilgrimages. But in the end, I've constructed a character. So I can't say.
Let me ask this and take a minute if you want to think about it. So imagine Rebecca were alive in some alternative reality, and she had read this book. And it was about her, but also a fiction
Mm-hmm.
from your own creative impulse and skill. I'm asking you, what would your grandmother think about the woman and the author and the creator that you have become based on reading Kantika?
What an interesting question. I don't think anyone's asked me that before. I think she would be proud of me because she was very creative and she liked to make things and she made things very beautifully. She was interestingly not literary at all. She didn't read. She found English a struggle. My grandfather was the literary one. He had no education, but he read Jewish history and animal books about animal behavior. And I mean, he was an intellectual. So he would be proud of me that I was a published writer. She didn't really care about that sort of thing. And she wasn't a reader. So I think they would be sort of excited that I'd made something and that it was out in the world. But more interestingly, in some ways to me, I do think, and my cousins and my mother have agreed with me about this because we've talked about it, that she would be excited to have someone inspired by her take central stage. That she always had a sense, she was a performer much more than I am. She knew she had an extraordinary kind of dignity and kind of knew that not only her own life, but every life was important. Like that part of, I think, why she was so amazing with Luna is she was just like, this is a person. Like this person needs to flower to the best of her ability. And even if it's really hard, like that's what you do as a human, not even just as a mother or a stepmother, but like that was sort of this innate, I don't know, innate, but whatever, the sort of goodness in her. She could be very tough. So it was complicated in some ways, but I think she knew that she was important, not in a kind of egotistic way, although there was a little of that. Like she liked, you'd be with her, if there was a piano or a microphone, she'd be up there. She liked the gaze. She knew she was really pretty. So I think she would have been interested. I think my grandfather would not have liked it. He was very private. He did not talk about his childhood, which was very difficult and poor, and his father abandoned them. And he wanted me to be a journalist. He was much more, you go for the truth and accuracy. And he was also very worried about how one earns a living. So he wanted me to get married and then be a journalist, but first get married. And I adored him too. And he was a very ethical, moral, good person, but he was also a person of his time and an immigrant worried about how one finds one's way, having pushed through a lot of things. So I think she would have been proud of me. I'm not sure she would have read it, honestly. Would she have read it? I never saw her read a book except the Bible. She read her
That's
French. She read her French Bible, the Psalms, and she was also very, very steadfast in her faith in a way that was interesting for me. And that I'm very secular. I mean, I'm very culturally Jewish, but I was not raised religiously. I'm not religious, and so that was a piece of her story that I found very interesting and moving, and that stretched me to kind of have to put myself. I would see it with her. She'd take us to synagogue. She always lit Shabbat candles, but we didn't do any of that at home. So
So that was another discovery in yourself that.
Yeah, and very moving. I mean, it didn't make me start attending synagogue, but it opened me up in some interesting ways, I think.
So let's take a moment to admire and reflect on these wonderful photographs.
Sure.
And I'm going to ask you to just describe one or at most two of the most important photographs in your creative transformation of the details of the family into Kantika, the novel. Which ones stopped you in your tracks or became an important element in your imagination as you wrote the story?
So I'll focus on a couple that are in the book and put them side by side, and then one that's not. So there's two in the book that were really interesting to me for both how beautiful they are and how different they are. So one of them is Rebecca as a teenager, probably 17, 16, 17, and she's wearing this very sort of folkloric embroidered outfit that I kind of assume she made because she could make anything. And it's very much not Western. It's very kind of almost looks Roma or folk, like a folk costume. And it's gorgeous. And she's beautiful and her expression's very strong and almost slightly combative. Like she's kind of meets your eye and looks like, I don't know, like a young warrior in some ways. So her strength and her beauty interested me there, as did her outfit. Like, what is it? That's not what you wore every day. You know, what does this signify? And is it kind of dressing up? And if so, as what? Next to that was a photo taken just a few years later, and I put both in the book after they moved to Barcelona, where she looks extraordinarily Western, or sort of in my mind French. She's got like a very elegant dress, and I think there's some fur in the photo, and she's kind of looks like she's from a totally different place. So I was very interested in her shape-shifting abilities, which she could do because she was such a good seamstress. Even after they lost money, she could make anything. And also her love of surfaces, and her ability to deploy them, that she used both her beauty and her sewing abilities as a way to get jobs and to attract people. And it's really evident when you look at these photos that she straddled a lot of different worlds. And so Turkey's very interesting in that way in the first place. In that era, it was very multicultural and cosmopolitan, but then they went to Spain. And she was educated in French. So all of the multilingual, multicultural contexts, I think, are really rich and interesting, but I was also very interested in how, as someone who needed to find work and had come from this privilege and needed to pass in certain ways in Spain, she could if she needed to, you know, in ways that other populations couldn't. She was white. She spoke a version of Spanish. She could look rich. She had tools that she could deploy to get what she needed in ways that were painful because there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but also worked. So that interested me. And then there's a photo that didn't make it into the book, but I have on my website, which is of Rebecca in Spain with her two little boys, and they are wearing sailor suits. And on the sailor suits are little patches that say US. So they're wearing American sailor suits. And that photo fascinated me because it was taken in Barcelona. So she, to provide a little context for people who haven't read the book, was in Barcelona as a single mother. Her first husband had died. She had these two little boys. And her sister was in the US and said, I know this man. He's also lost a spouse. He needs a wife. He has a daughter. The way I don't totally know, but the way I pictured how this photo worked is that she actually made her kids US sailor suits to kind of almost like the way you would on like Match.com. Like, here they are. They're cute. They're American. Like, they can be American. And then, almost ironically, my Uncle David was in the Navy on a ship that was bombed in World War II. So it was also a kind of foreshadowing. But the other thing that really moved me about that photo, and the copy that I have, if you flip it over to the back, which I always did with these photos, you can learn so much from the studio or the date or the writing. She had written by hand, They're in Spain, my darlings. And she must have written it right after she arrived in the US when she had had to leave her children behind and it was separated from them for 9 months. And the there is misspelled. It's spelled THERE because she was just learning English. And then the other part that I found sort of beautiful and also heart wrenching was that darlings is spelled DOLLINGS, Dollings, because she just moved to New York. So she's writing with a New York accent. So the way that photo, it just the front contains so much and then the back contained so much with her struggle. She tried to write in English. It was hard for her. She was doing it. She was writing with a pronunciation that she'd landed at because it was obviously her learning was oral. It wasn't written. She wasn't taking classes. And she'd set them up to be American, but they were separated. And as I was writing this was, it's still happening, but this was when there was a lot of stuff happening with kids being separated at the border from their parents. And I was just viscerally thinking about what it's like to be apart from your kids, because of the way migration works or the law works.
Thank you. Those are indeed wonderful pictures. And the one that wasn't in the book is so, as you said, so profoundly evocative of both Rebecca and her children and the future stories of those two boys when they did come to America and grew up in America. One final question, which is, can you give me a few last words from your grandmother, Rebecca? What are just a few phrases or sentences or things that you remember about her that you want to say as we wrap up?
I guess one of the things I really loved about her was sort of how alert to beauty and she had an artist's temperament in certain ways, and she would do things like you'd be sitting next to her and she'd grab your hand and she'd say, "It's so beautiful." And I think to be a writer or an artist of any kind, and even in a way to be a present human, noticing the world and slowing down is very important. And I both have tendencies in that direction and am kind of quick and hurried a lot. Just, I don't know, because of busyness and the kind of world we live in, maybe. But so she would take my hand, which was just, I'd be like, "It's just my hand, Grandma." And she would see it and kind of examine it. There was something very almost reverent and appreciative about the way she approached food and bodies and her children and her grandchildren. So those kind of tiny moments, that's not in the book, have stayed with me, as has her singing. She sang all the time. That there was something kind of, I guess, her capacity for joy and for noticing have stayed with me, and I think actually impacted me in the way I try to live. But in certain ways, she was better at it than I am, if that makes sense.
In 1985, when I was 21, I taped my grandmother, Rebecca Levy, telling stories. I'd always known she'd had a challenging and colorful past: 2 husbands, 6 children, many countries, multiple languages, and upheavals. But there was so much I didn't know. I knew she was Jewish, but was she Turkish or Spanish? The fact that she was an embroiderer of both fabric and reality was common knowledge in our family. Was she telling the truth when she said she'd been born rich and lost everything? In my interviews, I asked her many questions, though not nearly enough, and she offered me many glimpses of her life.